Richard Hadlock was a jazz man. He played soprano sax and clarinet in dozens of jazz bands in New York City and in the San Francisco Bay Area. He published a jazz magazine, contributed articles and reviews to a number of publications, authored a jazz textbook, recorded numerous albums, was nominated for a Grammy for his liner notes, hosted a long-running jazz radio show, had an impressive collection of jazz recordings, and Richard was my uncle. We shared not only DNA, but summers in the Thousand Islands on the Canadian border, and stories about life in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, where he spent his teen years and where I was born. But Richard wasn't just a jazz man. His college degree was in sociology. He and his wife Ruth cared deeply about those less fortunate and advocated for the displaced indigenous peoples of California. This is Richard's story about the years when he and Ruth put their careers on hold to live and teach on the Kashaya Reservation.
I'm Richard Hadlock, and I lived in this house for 4 years while I was teaching in the next door school. It's a one-room school on the Kashaya Reservation in Northern California. It was my first teaching job, so it was quite challenging to teach 8 grades in one room. Ruth, who was a children's librarian, was helping out, especially organizing the little library we had. So it was that we started teaching in 1965 and stayed for 4 years. And the children virtually began to seem like our own kids because we were so involved in their education and their home life. And frequently they came to this house just to visit after school.
Richard Hadlock and Ruth Grossman had both spent their teen years in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, but had not met there. They each returned to the U.S. for college. Richard received a BA in sociology, but chose to become a professional jazz musician. Ruth received a BA in library science. She was an avid jazz fan. They met in Greenwich Village, fell in love, and married in 1959. In 1962, they moved to San Francisco so Richard could join the Turk Murphy Jazz Band. There they read Ishi in Two Worlds, the biography of the last wild Indian in North America. That story inspired them to work with the California Indians. Richard became certified as a teacher and principal and was hired for the Kashaya Reservation School. He shot home movies to document life on the reservation.
The ancestral homelands of the Kashaya Pomo were located in present-day Sonoma County, starting at the rocky coast and continuing up through the lush forests for several miles. First contact with non-indigenous peoples occurred in 1811 when Russian seal hunters sailed into the area and established Fort Ross on the coast. After the Russians abandoned the fort, A general store was built nearby, and the area became known as Stewart's Point. The Kashaya did not own land until 1916, when the U.S. government purchased 40 acres for a small reservation. Stewart's Point Kashaya Rancheria. The rancheria lies deep in the forested hills, 5 miles up from the California coast on the heavily wooded and winding Skaggs Spring Road. When Richard and Ruth moved to the rancheria in 1965, it was an isolated hideaway with no running water, no phones, and limited resources. The village was home to about 20 families who lived in small wooden houses gathered near the roundhouse, the center of their indigenous religious life.
And blocks and things.
Richard and Ruth developed a special relationship with Essie Parrish and her family, including her daughters Violet and Vivian.
Remember?
That looks like a little parish.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Essie Parrish was a shaman and the spiritual leader of the Kashaya Pomo during the 1960s. She was known as a dreamer and a traditional healer as practiced in the native Bole Maru religion. Essie strongly believed in the importance of education for her people, as well as the importance of preservation of their native cultural traditions and language. She was also well known and respected as an expert basket maker.
I'm the daughter of Essie Nellie Pinola Fisk Parrish. Her famous thing was what she told you, know who you are. You're an Indian, and don't be ashamed to say you're Indian, because it's great to be an Indian. I had to respect my mother's teaching. Like she used to say, one of the things you need to do is learn your language, learn your history, learn your genealogy, learn about the culture.
Essie taught the rancheria residents how to prepare traditional foods. Acorn mush and tup-tup, a flatbread of acorn flour similar to a tortilla, were a part of the traditional Kashaya diet. Preparing the acorn flour required gathering and shelling the acorns, grinding them into a powder, leaching out the bitter tannins, and finally cooking the mush or tup-tup. A traditional Kashaya meal might also include fish, abalone, mussels, and marine mammals, plus a variety of dried sea plants. Essie was very skilled in the art of traditional pomo basket making and taught her techniques to younger Kashaya. These intricate baskets were woven from woolly sedge grass and bulrush roots, redwood bark, and willow and redbud branches. In her demonstration, Essie and her helpers first gather sedge roots. She takes care not to damage the roots, often using a traditional wooden digging stick. After gathering, roots will be soaked for 2 days and then aged for 2 months. Next, the roots are groomed and smoothed. Essie often used her teeth in the process. Finally, the basket is started with a knot, each knot fashioned in a style unique to the basket maker. After weaving, baskets are decorated with beads, quills, shells, and feathers. Traditionally, the baskets were used for cooking, gathering and storing food, trapping fish or animals, as toys, cradles, and gifts, and for ceremonies.
I remember Mom telling me, learn about your religion. And I'm so happy to see these familiar faces.
This is our meal, welcome in the spring. It's our law of reciprocity so that we can gather berries and things from the land, and we do our 4 nights of praying and show our thankfulness for the things that are put on this land for us to gather, and all of those things we remember at this time.
Thank you, you young people. I would say learn about your history. Learn about your culture. Learn about your religion.
Oh, ya ke kamsedu majihenj ishkan. Ya ke maatoldo. Mi ke amacho shibawi, mi ke amacho choshoweya.
The first year, my wife Ruth, who is a children's librarian, was helping out. In the middle of that first year, she said, you know what's missing is a plan for the pre-first grade children right here. And maybe we can offer something in our kitchen, which is just behind this door. So we bought a table that would raise up for us and come down lower for the children. And I think we had half a dozen kids coming to begin a preschool. She also got very interested in getting a Head Start program going. So I'd like to introduce Ruth and let her tell the story.
What we saw was needed was a program to introduce the younger children and have them ready to start first grade. There was no program for children under the age of 6. The Head Start program nationwide was just in its infancy then. We decided that Head Start would be a wonderful thing for the children. I read up as much as I could on what the Head Start concept was all about, getting children ready to be successful in school, and we started a preschool in the house. This is where we started the preschool.
Head Start regulations required a freestanding building to house the preschool. Richard and Ruth worked tirelessly to acquire federal funding to pay for that building. The Rancheria residents also worked hard to turn that goal into a reality. They cleared and leveled the land, placed piping and a septic system in the ground, and soon a speed space building was delivered and erected on the site. Head Start also required a phone in the building, but there were no phone lines on the reservation. Ruth spent hours on a payphone in the not-so-nearby town of Walala, insisting that the local phone company install a phone. Finally, the phone lines were installed, and success! The Head Start preschool program was up and running.
It ran from about 10 in the morning until noon. We didn't have much, if any, equipment, a few sort of hand-me-down things, but we always had plenty of books for me to use to read to the children, many of whom did not have books at home and had very little exposure to the fun of reading. We did art projects, we played games, we occasionally went on little field trips down to the other end of the reservation, perhaps to gather acorns. We also wanted the Kashaya children to see how valuable their own traditions and their own culture were, and also for the non-Indian children who came into the program from the surrounding communities to see a very rich tradition. We wanted the parents to feel involved in both the Head Start culture and the local Native American California Indian culture. We had not only standard school-type meals, but meals where they ate local fish, acorn mush, apples from the remains of an apple orchard. We really tried to introduce the most interesting things, the things that would mean the most to young children. One of our field trips was to Fort Ross, where Russians had established an outpost. It was important to take the children to Fort Ross because the history of the Kashaya Indians and the Russians who built the beautiful fort that is such a tourist attraction today. There were warm relationships between some of the Russians and perhaps Aleuts who came down from Alaska and some of the Indian women, some of whom went back actually to Russia. It was important, I think, for them to realize that it was not the isolated community that some might have thought, that it was a very rich culture with many strains, the Russian with the Aleut, as well as with the Kashaya Pomo people.
In 1968, Essie Parrish was notified by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that a VIP planned to visit the reservation. That VIP was Senator Robert F. Kennedy. His helicopter landed at the rancheria, and Senator Kennedy was greeted by some 200 Indians, their neighbors, and the Kashaya tribal elders, which included Essie as the spiritual leader and her husband, tribal chairman Sidney Parrish. Senator Kennedy visited Richard and his students in their one-room schoolhouse, where the senator was mobbed by newspaper and television reporters.
Very difficult, and these children find it difficult. I think they said just one child that's graduated from high school in the last 50 years.
Does the
So
treatment...
that there are obviously fewer and fewer jobs for the unskilled and the untrained, so that these children will have a very difficult time unless they have the training and education. Situation's very unfortunate at the moment. It's not just a question of expenditure of funds, it's a question of the interest by the state and by the federal government in the Indians. And secondly, it's also going to be a major effort by the Indians themselves. No question that the Indians have been the ignored part of our population.
Afterwards, Senator Kennedy was escorted to the roundhouse and entertained with Kashaya Pomo dances, a feast of traditional acorn mush, and given one of Essie's baskets, which is now in the Smithsonian Museum. The Kashaya did not escape their own tragedy. Richard and Ruth also obtained federal funding for numerous field trips so the students and their parents could travel beyond the reservation. During their 4-year tenure, trips were arranged to sites meaningful to Native American culture throughout the states of California and Arizona. To give the students an overview of the reservation's location, Richard had them create a topographical model of the area, then planned a school trip to an airfield where the students took to the skies to view the reservation from above. Afterwards, the pilots thrilled them all with an air show. Richard also organized a few side trips that were purely meant for fun. Richard and Ruth's days on the reservation were more than just lessons and studies. They often piled the children into their Land Rover to visit a nearby swimming hole. Leisure time also included picnics, and they found plenty of time for team sports. A favorite site for the reservation children was called the opening.
In 1969, Richard and Ruth left the rancheria full of memories of their learning time. It was not in Richard's nature to detail the contributions they'd made while living with the Kashaya, nor did he tell me all the reasons he'd chosen to title his film A Learning Time. But it was obvious that Richard and Ruth had learned a deep respect for the cultural traditions of the Kashaya Pomo, as well as the importance of preserving those traditions. And they'd found a special place in their hearts for the children of the reservation schools.